2 billion years ago, eukaryotic cells with nuclei appeared. By 1 billion years ago, multicellular plants appeared. And from 850 to 630 million years ago, the entire Earth was frozen over, was glaciated, the oceans were covered with ice, in what was called snowball Earth. But beneath that ice, it formed like a great greenhouse covering the ocean. So it was a great aquatic greenhouse, and beneath that, the photosynthesis of the cyanobacteria just went wild and pumped up all this oxygen, so that eventually the oxygen warmed up the Earth, the ice melted, and the most amazing events started happening. If 580 million years ago, we get what is called the Ediacaran explosion, which is the first complex life that appeared on Earth. But it left no descendants. It was a whole proliferation of extremely odd-looking stuff that looked like, oh, I don't know, ferns and sand dollars and things like that. We have no idea what any of it, how it worked or anything, because the entire biota died off. It's sort of an aborted conception that just didn't make it. But a little while later, the next one did. 544 million years ago, after 3 billion years of single-cell life filling the seas, waiting for that next move, much like spores or seeds or ova, waiting for the moment of conception. That moment occurred 544 million years ago, and the event is called the Cambrian explosion. And in that event, all kinds of extremely odd and weird creatures appeared. These are models of a few of them. This one we're probably more familiar with. Eventually a bunch of bugs came out of it. Some of them we have absolutely no idea what in the hell they were. But there was 26 different phyla of life forms appeared at that time. Now today there are only half a dozen phyla of life. So most of those didn't make it. So you've got to imagine it's like getting a ball of different wildflower seeds and kind of scattering them out and seeing which ones actually take and root and grow. And that's kind of what happened to the Earth. And out of that 26 different ones, including some of these guys, the ones that survived include us. Now, all animal life, since the Cambrian explosion, carried a unique new gene complex that came in that fertilization. We call it the homeobox genes, or HOX, and you might want to Google it and look it up. You'll find some fascinating things. This is the gene complex that governs the ordering of the sequence of the segments in the body. We got a head here, we got vertebrae, we got arms, legs, all that kind of stuff, and bilateral symmetry on both sides. We're all governed by the homeobox gene complex. And there is no precursor to it on Earth. This is one of those things that clearly must have come from space. Now, at that same time, a very interesting little critters appeared. Let's see, I think I have a picture here. Yeah. These guys. If any of you saw Neil deGrasse Tyson's Cosmos series,
yes,
he devoted one whole episode to these guys. He loves them, and I do too. They're called tardigrades, and they're incredibly cute. They look like something that should have come from the Barsoom of John Carter of Mars books or something. They do not like. And there have been over 1,700 different species identified, and probably more. They've only been discovered fairly recently. They're about the size of a period at the end of a sentence. But they're everywhere, all over the Earth, in every condition. And they took some up into space, on the space station. They did an experiment where they took various hardy forms of life, like lichens and bacteria and tardigrades, and they put them outside to see how they'd do. Well, most of them just died. They really couldn't take, come on, absolute zero temperature, complete vacuum, heavy-duty radiation. What can live through that? But they brought the tardigrades back in, and they unrolled themselves and went back to having a happy life, no problem at all. Now, the conditions that create evolution, obviously, are the conditions that any creature grows up in. So if animals live in cold northern climates, they develop, thick furry coats and stuff like that. Well, what conditions give you absolute zero temperature, total vacuum, and heavy-duty radiation? These are not terrestrial conditions. So creatures that evolved to adapt to those, obviously, are spacefaring. And that's what Neil deGrasse Tyson talked about. He suggested that comets flying around all over the place carry spores and seeds of life. You may be familiar with Terence McKenna's thesis that mushroom spores are spacefarers because they also are designed to live under those conditions. His idea was that they travel from world to world to try to raise the intelligence of the native species to build spaceships and carry them to the next place. And I rather like that. I think that's a charming idea. I'm all for it, you know? And if mushrooms is what made us smart, well, here's to the mushrooms. Mushrooms for everybody. So from that point to now, the biosphere of the Earth has evolved as a single organism. That point was the conception of Gaia. The same DNA and the same protoplasm permeates all the life on Earth today. So I like to imagine a scene of the early Earth. Let's see, here we go. This is my little artistic representation, you see. Kind of fuse it with an ovum, with the sperm coming in, the Earth with the comets coming in. And I think it's a very apt analogy, so there we are. Now, exactly how life emerged on Earth. Let's take a look at that. Life, cells, organisms, all those things, from the initial conception, they divide and subdivide the material in them. Protoplasm, the DNA in every single cell, but it's still all the same. And that's the important thing. This is why we consist of about 3 trillion or more cells, all kinds of stuff, but we still remain one single organism. And the factory of that is what we'll be talking more about in the second half of this presentation, a phenomenon we call entanglement that creates a union between all things that have ever been connected with each other. For no matter how many vessels water is poured into, well, it's still all the same water. And no matter how many divisions the protoplasm is divided into, it all still remains one single organism. And if the vessels are destroyed, well, the water just flows out and flows back to the sea. Now, using that metaphor we talked about earlier about how water and spirit can be seen in exactly the same method, this gives us a perfect vision of how spirit works as well. You know, temporarily, we pour it into these various cups, but we can't say the shape of water is sort of this kind of a conical cylindrical, that's what water is shaped like, because it isn't. It isn't shaped like anything. And as we, as individuals, dip our little bit in from the well of life, we each become a container for a time, but we are only a container. We are only a container, and the water just keeps on coming. As does the spirit, and you can't stop the spirit. So we'll just put a little more in there. Now, in the history of life, there have been 5 great mass extinctions. The most famous one, of course, being the one that wiped out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. But there have been dozens of lesser extinctions over this time. And if you put them all on a chart, they occur on a fairly regular frequency of about every 37 million years. Now, the last one of those was 23 million years ago. So we probably have a few years to go before the next one. And we've been trying to figure out what happens every 37 million years that creates these phenomena, because they appear to be based on impacts. We get comets and asteroids that hit the Earth. Well, we've discovered that as the solar system revolves around the plane of the galaxy, it goes up and down through that plane in a great big spiraling thing around it. And every 37 million years, it goes up or down through the equatorial dust plane of the galaxy. which means that it dislodges a lot of this enormous amount of planetary bodies that lie in the Oort cloud at the outer fringes of the shell of the solar system, which we didn't have any idea about until fairly recently when we sent probes out there and said, what's all this stuff, you know, all these big rocks. You know, we used to think that Pluto was a planet, and now we realize it's just another one of these many, many big old rocks, some of them much bigger, hanging out there in the far edges. And if things get a little bit shaky, every 37 million years, some of that stuff moves into the inner solar system and all hell breaks loose. But each time this happens, and it's happened many times, especially the great mass extinctions, which have wiped out up to 95% of all life on Earth, that's some of the big ones, life recovers. And moreover, the animals that are wiped out get replaced by analogs that are often stunningly similar, such as the ichthyosaurs and the dolphins, for example, which are pretty hard to tell the difference. And many others. It's like the entire DNA of Gaia is a hologram. It's a holographic thing. So just as any tiny part of a hologram contains the pattern of the whole thing, the whole picture, so any part of the DNA of Gaia, like a stem cell, essentially, can eventually reproduce the entire biosphere, which gives an indication of how it can be possible that planets can be seeded by spores carried through comets. It doesn't take a whole lot to produce that. Now, moving on from the geological history and the history of life, which is certainly lots of fun, let's go into human history. The greatest discontinuity in human history occurred about 3,600 years ago. In the year 1627 BCE, we've been able to pinpoint it. The most obvious event that's famous is the explosion of an island we call Thera, north of Crete. It exploded with a force 10 times that of Krakatoa in 1888, and it pretty much devastated the entire eastern Mediterranean with huge tsunamis and ash falls and such. I mean, like 100 feet of ash fell in Crete, and tsunamis washing over Greece just totally just cleaned off the entire Peloponnesus. This event is also the basis of what we have the Atlantis myth. And the thing about that, Atlantis is Greek meaning land of the pillar. And in ancient times, and in the era that this was discussed, there were 4 great volcanoes in the ancient world that were believed to be the pillars that held up the heavens, because the plume of smoke that they set up into the heavens was like a pillar supporting the sky. So these were the 4 great pillars. These were Etna and Vesuvius in Italy, and Metania in Greece, and Thera, or Atlantis, in the Aegean. This event is also recorded in history as the events around the Exodus. The famous parting of the Red Sea was a tsunami. The water gets all sucked out, people run across, water comes all back. Whoops. The rain of stones and fire from the heavens is the fall of debris from the volcano, and the pillar of smoke and fire on the horizon, that's a volcano way out there somewhere. So we think of these stories as myths and legends only, but they tend to account actual events in the best possible way people have of describing them, which is what we're still doing. Our descriptions of what goes on have changed radically just in some of our own lifetimes. This is also referred to as the war in heaven, the great battle between the angels in which some of them were driven to earth and some of them retained in the heavens. In the Greek mythology, this is the clash of the Titans, the time when the Olympian gods arose and overthrew the Titans, which were the first children of Gaia, of Mother Earth. The flood of Deucalion and Pyrrha in the Greek myths is another description of the same event. So this is well noted, but it wasn't just the explosion of Thera, or Atlantis, that gave us a foundation of stories. Throughout the entire Middle East, and particularly around the Black Sea at that time, was an enormous fall of meteorites, nickel iron meteorites, interestingly enough. And these gave rise to the Iron Age. They also gave rise to a new generation of gods, gods whose primary attributes were hurling thunderbolts, gods of the heavens. Because prior to that time, The deities were all beings of the earth, Gaia and the Titans and the children of the earth and the spirits of nature and of vegetation and animals and all that stuff. And then suddenly we got these sky gods appearing. Now how did that happen? Well, how that happened is this. That area of the world was a vast sea of grass, just endless grass. No forests, no mountains, no rivers, no lakes. The whole area north of the Black Sea, the steppes of Russia, was just this vast sea of grass. And the people who lived there, the Kurgans and later the Scythians, were the people who tamed horses and learned to ride them. They were the first people who developed tack to make that possible. And so they were nomads, and they roamed this great sea of grass, and they made raids on villages and people on the outside, and they went back. But their markers to designate where you go and what to see, there was nothing on the ground to look at. There were no mountains, there were no trees, no lakes. Instead, their markers were the stars in the heavens, the constellations. These were the people who designed, first conceptualized, connecting the dots of the constellations. So all the 200 and some constellations we know today all derive from this era of these people. And therefore their gods were the gods of the sky. And so when their gods started hurling